So now what I want to do is I'm going to show a little bit of kind of the workflow of how you would work within the tools and effects to do some organic modeling on an object. I'm going to go ahead and, just for the sake of just showing the tools, I'm going to pick an easy object to create, which is an apple. I'm just going to create a little apple object. So for example, since an apple is kind of spherical in nature, I'm going to start with a sphere, and I'm using, as I talked about before in the primitives, I'm using an organic sphere so that when I push and pull on the surface of this object, it will have smoother edges, and so I can create a more organic object. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into Tools, and what I'm going to do is, I know that for the top of an apple, it kind of pinches in sharply towards the center and then slowly kind of tapers out. So to do that, I'm actually going to I actually have this new brush that I've made down here, which you can make your own brushes as well. I covered that a little bit earlier, but I'll go ahead and do it again. So if I just come up here, since this is kind of the base of what I want to use, I'm going to duplicate this brush, and I'm going to go ahead and edit it. And since an apple actually has kind of a sharper point towards the center, I just want to make this brush have a sharper point. But I still want it to taper off nice and smooth. So I'm just going to move the points down to get more of a sharper edge to my brush, and you can see I'm getting more of a point here. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. And I'm going to want to push directly in, and since I want to do the top of the apple, I'm going to make sure I'm in the top view. Now, you can't really notice that something has changed here because it's a perfect sphere, so I am indeed looking at the top of the sphere. It's just that since it's perfectly round, it's really hard to tell that it changed in the view. So I'm going to just make my radius a little bit big here, make sure I'm pushing in, and my pressure is where I want it at. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of line about center. Just start pushing in, and of course I could have made my pressure a little bit more than that. So let's see how that looks. Yeah, it looks pretty good for pushing in on the top of the. If I was a little bit better at adjusting my brush so I didn't have little ripples there, then I wouldn't have gotten the ripples in there. That's from the brush. So actually I can smooth those out by using the smooth tool here and start to get rid of some of those if I want. So anyway, that's good enough for what we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I want to do something similar to the bottom, because the bottom, of course, pushes in as well on an apple, but it doesn't push in as sharply as it does where the stem is. So I'm going to use the softer edged brush, and I'm going to make my radius a little bit, just a little bit smaller. And I'll go ahead and start pushing it in right here. Oh, hello. And I gotta pick my brush here, and I'm going to go ahead and start pushing in on the center of the object. Get kind of while going in for the base there. Now, on an apple, usually has little edges that pop out through the bottom, almost like little feet. So to create that, I'm going to make my radius smaller. Now I could go in and do these individually if I wanted, but because we have this nice symmetry tool, and I want it to be about, instead of, let's make it 5. You can see this is a 5-way symmetry brush based from a center point, and so I'm going to use a normals brush, and I'm going to make sure that my direction is pointing out, and I'll give it a little bit more pressure. And so now I can start pulling out those little feet that you get on an apple. So now if I rotate this around, see I got kind of the little feet there on the apple. So now one cool thing to keep in mind is that so far I've just been using the tools. Well, another thing that you'll find as you start to use Amorphium is that you'll, at least for me, the way I like to work is I'll do some stuff in tools, and then I'll hop over to effects and then go back to tools and go back and forth. And that's because effects will give you deformations to the object as a whole, which actually gives you different options than if you were using a brush. So the combination of the two can actually give you a lot of control. So I'm going to go ahead, and because this apple's a little bit fat and squatty, I'm going to actually stretch him a little bit, make him a little bit more elongated, about like so. And I also want to do, let's take bulge him out a little bit, take belly, and belly actually bulges more towards the center. Can I bring it in so there's like kind of a little bit of a indentation in the center a little. And then sometimes when you have an apple, it won't be totally even. Like you see how it's perfectly flat across the top there. Now I can do it two ways. I could actually go in and just start pushing and pulling a little bit to make it a little different, which is actually what I'm going to do next, but after this. But first, like some apples are slightly bent, and so we're going to just bend this apple just a little bit, just enough to make him slightly less symmetrical. So it's bent just a little. And then I'll come into tools, and the normals brush is really good for doing this, the stuff I'm going to do next, just because it follows the contour of the object so that you can always push in perpendicular to the contour of your object. And the reason they call it a normal brush is not because it's the normal brush you want to use, it's because what they call the surface of the actual perpendicular surface of an object, a 3D object, is called a surface normal. Surface normals are always perpendicular to the polygon of the object, which is a 3D geometry term that is used in the 3D world. So just whenever you see normal brush, that is talking about the normals of the object, the actual perpendicular part of the object. So I'm going to make sure my symmetry is off. I'm going to push in on the object with low pressure but a slightly larger brush, and this way I can kind of just start to, since a apple is slightly, you know, it's not perfectly round, it's got little dents and imperfect edges, so I'm just kind of denting it in places, and maybe I want to do it a little bit where the legs are here on the apple, and I'll go ahead and rotate him around. So you can see I'm getting the little nice dented imperfections that you see on apples. I'll go ahead and maybe push in a little bit on one side, maybe a little bit over here. So it's not totally perfect, so it gives it more of an organic feel. So that's going to be good for, so we got a pretty good organic little apple there. Now we're going to want to make a stem. Let's just go ahead and make a stem for this. And since the stem is kind of cylindrical in nature, I'll go ahead and use a cylinder to make the stem. So we'll just draw a little cylinder like this. And now I'll come back into tools, and I'll choose mesh cylinder. I'll go back to a front view. I'm going to use effects for most of this, and that's because it allows me to modify the whole thing as a whole here with these deformations. So one thing I want to do is I'll go ahead and taper the top a little bit, just a smidge. I'll stretch it just a little bit more, make a little bit longer stem. And also keep in mind that if you're doing a stretch, if you hold down shift, it'll lock the axes so that if you're moving up and down, it'll keep the horizontal 100%, and also the same for if you're moving horizontally, it'll keep the vertical 100%. If you're holding down shift, it'll lock one of the axes for you. The other thing I'm going to do to this is I'm going to use the bulge instead of bulging out, I'm actually going to bulge in a little bit, taper it in so it looks, you know, kind of how a stem will get slender and start to get more thick towards the top. And I'm going to also bend the stem so that nice little bent little stem. And now another thing I can do is that since this is a nice hard edge here at the top, and I don't really want a nice hard edge on the top of that, I'll make my radius a little bit smaller, and I'll use the smooth tool, and let me rotate this a little round so I can, and I'll zoom in on it too so I can really see what I'm doing. Let's move it here and zoom in a little bit more. Alright, so now I'm going to smooth this, and actually let's go ahead and turn my pressure and radius up a little bit. And so now it'll round that edge more, make it less of a hard-edged stem. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fit this back into my view. And also, you see how perfectly bent this is. I want to have some imperfections on this as well, since it is organic and nothing in nature, especially plant life, is perfectly symmetrical. Give it some little imperfections in the stem there. Okay, so now I've got this nice little stem that I've made, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and line it up with the object, and we'll go ahead and now that I'm moving this, if it's too hard to click it here, I can just select them individually here. Now that's selected, anywhere I click in here with the vertical move tool will let me move it. So now it's not quite placed where I want it, right about there. And so there's our apple. Now, of course, it's a blue apple, and you may not want a blue apple. And I'll go more into texturing later on in the CD, but just for the sake of making it not a blue apple, I'll just go into paint real quick, choose a brown, use the fill tool, fill brown on the stem, and I'll go ahead and choose the apple here, and since I'm zoomed all the way in on it, let's go ahead and fit it, and we'll choose kind of a reddish color. We use the fill tool again, fill the apple, and one last finishing touch, go into materials, we'll change to a cloud pattern, and we'll edit the clouds, and I'll put paint as one layer, so I get that red paint in there as one, and we'll pick a different color, maybe give it a little bit of a green in there. Bring it down, and we'll click done. So now a little bit more of a realistic looking textured apple, and that's basically how you work with your tools and effects to do organic modeling.